All the Young Dudes, Sirius's Perspective by Rollercosterwords. Chapter 10. First Year, History. Saturday the 23rd of October, 1971. For the next week, Remus didn't avoid him, exactly. Not as he'd been before. But he made sure that Sirius never caught him alone, always careful to remain in the presence of their fellow marauders, or else choosing to spend time in the crowded common room. Of course, he also continued to dart off on his own, and while Sirius attempted a few times to catch him leaving, Lupin was just too slippery. So it wasn't until next weekend that Sirius finally caught him, alone in their common room, flicking through one of James's Quidditch magazines, which was odd, as Remus had already made it clear that he had zero interest in the sport, no matter how the other boys tried to explain to him that it was one of life's greatest joys. Sirius had found that direct questions seemed to work best with Remus, so as he trotted over to the bed, he said bluntly, "Did you just never get taught?" Remus waited a moment to respond, pointedly turning the page and acting as if he was entirely absorbed in an article about the month's newest models. "I got taught." Sirius continued to stand, stubbornly, at the end of the bed. The article was outdated anyway, and not very interesting, even if you could read. Finally, Remus released a resigned sigh and closed the magazine. "I got taught," he repeated. "I just never learned properly. When I look at words, I don't think I see what everyone else does. It doesn't make any sense. All the letters keep jumping around and changing. Teachers said I was just thick." Sirius blinked, studying him. He'd never considered that two people might just look at something and see two entirely different things. He stared into Remus's eyes, wondering what it was about them that was wired differently. "But how have you been doing it?" he insisted, waiting expectantly for an answer. Of course, Sirius had suspected for a few weeks, but to be quite honest, the confirmation that Remus couldn't read had still been a shock. He was so clearly brilliant, with the way he mastered spells. Sirius had thought that he was just too much of a rebel to be bothered with homework. Remus seemed baffled by the question. "Doing what?" "Well, everything. All your work here at Hogwarts." Now Remus was looking at him as if he were thick. "Sirius, I haven't been doing it. In case you haven't noticed, I'm in detention every night." Ugh, he was impossible. "Well, yeah, obviously," Sirius waved his hand dismissively. "But the other day, in potions, I saw you. You didn't take any notes. You didn't even look at the book, or the blackboard. But you still repeated the ingredients for the cure of boils perfectly. Slughorn gave you 5 points. Remus flushed and shook his head. "Oh, that's easy. Slughorn told me how to do it the lesson before. I just remembered it." "Bloody hell. You must have a brilliant memory then." Remus just shrugged, looking for all the world like he didn't understand what was so impressive about brewing a potion perfectly without having any practice, after being told one time an entire week ago how to do it. "If you could read, you'd be as good as me and James. Better, probably," Sirius mused. Remus snorted. "Modest Black." "Well, you would," Sirius reiterated distractedly. "Your wand work is so much more natural, and if your memory is as good as you say it is..." He lost himself for a moment in the thought. "I bet there's a spell for it." Remus huffed a laugh, as if the idea were ridiculous. "You're going to cure me with a spell?" "Why not?" Sirius stuck his lip out, petulant and slightly offended by the disbelief in Remus's tone. But the other boy just said simply, "Magic can't fix stuff like that. Why else does James wear glasses?" "I think there are spells for eyesight," Sirius countered. "Maybe they're just not worth the effort. Too dangerous, or complicated, or something." It's not just a reading. It's not just a reading," Sirius insisted. "It's not just a reading," Remus insisted. "My writing's crap too. I'm so slow. It comes out all messy." "There are definitely spells for that," Sirius assured him. "You can bewitch your quill. I've seen my father do it on official documents. His handwriting's really scratchy normally." Remus stared at him as if he were mad. Why are you so interested anyway? Sirius pointedly ignored the darkest corner of his mind. the part where he was squashing down everything he'd been trying not to think about and focused instead on the boy in front of him. "You're my fellow Marauder! We can't have you in detention every day. What if the Slytherins strike back? We'll need your evil mind for pranks." This gave him an idea, and he continued. "Speaking of, I'm assuming you haven't done your history homework yet." "Nope." "Okay then, let's get started." Sirius jumped off the bed and began rooting around in his trunk. Remus protested immediately, standing up and folding his arms with a frown as he said, "No, you're not doing my homework for me." "Too bloody right I'm not." Sirius refrained from rolling his eyes as he pulled out a history of magic. "I just fancied refreshing my memory, that's all. So I'm going to sit here and read it out loud, because it helps me study. If you happen to retain some of it in that enormous brain of yours, then there's not much I can do about it." Remus's frown deepened, and he said sullenly, "Haven't you got something better to do? Where's James, anyway?" Watching the Gryffindor Quidditch practice, Sirius shot back, settling down on the bed and opening the book. Reckons he'll get on the team next year, so he's trying to pick up some tips. Peter's followed him, obviously. "Now, be quiet, please. I'm trying to work." He cleared his throat. A History of Magic by Bertha Bagshot. Chapter 1. Ancient Egypt. The Rites and Rituals of Infantry. For a few moments, Remus hovered in the middle of the room, arms still crossed. He looked as though he was trying to decide whether to storm off or not, but eventually he seemed to give in, slouching over the bed and sitting down with a scowl. A bit more time passed, and the scowl disappeared. He relaxed, leaning back on his arms, weariness bleeding from his features as he listened. Surprisingly, he actually seemed quite interested. Sirius thought the text was somewhat dry, but then much of the covered things he had already learned under his parents. For Lupin, Sirius supposed it was all brand new. Eventually, Remus lay back, arms behind his head, and closed his eyes. When Sirius glanced at him, there was a small, unconscious smile on his face. Sirius turned back to the book and realized that he was smiling too. He made it halfway through Chapter 5, Tribes in the Advancements of Roman Battle Magic, before his voice began to give out completely, and he had to close the book. Evening had fallen, bleeding deep blue and orange into the sky outside, and the room around them seemed alight with the glow of the setting sun. "I don't think I can study any more today," Sirius croaked. Remus's eyes snapped open, and he sat up quickly, blinking. "That's okay," he said quickly. "It's dinner now. I'm starving." They stood, stretched, and started downstairs. At the Gryffindor table, James and Peter were already waiting in their usual seats. Sirius drained a goblet of pumpkin juice, which soothed the worst of the scratchiness in his throat, before asking, "How was practice?" "Cracking," James said enthusiastically, beaming as he speared a sausage with his fork. "How come you didn't come?" "Homework," Sirius replied casually, catching Remus's eye and smiling a small, private smile. James entertained them throughout dinner with a detailed account of the Quidditch practice, including the names of every number, their positions, their techniques, their weaknesses, even some of their birthdays. Peter piped up occasionally, usually to remind everyone that he agreed with what James was saying, but Sirius was in such a good mood that it hardly even irritated him tonight. Pudding was a disappointment, millionaire shortbread, which neither he nor James liked. Remus and Peter both acted like they were mad, scoffing down the lot. In fact, when Remus saw that Peter had already eaten both other boys' plates, he shot him a bit of a dirty look. "I've got some sweets," Peter said nervously, as if realizing the mistake he'd made coming between Remus and food. He dug in the pockets of his robes and pulled out a bulging brown bag. "Mum sent me them. Help yourself." "Oh, cheers, Pete," James said happily, and the rest of them wasted no time tearing into the surprisingly wide selection of candies. They didn't slow until they demolished about half of the bag, and all looked a bit queasy. "What homework were you doing?" James asked, scratching his chin absent-mindedly. "I thought we'd finished everything for this week." Seeing James scratch made his own skin feel prickly, and Sirius itched at his collarbone as he said, "Yeah, I was behind on history. I had to go back and check something." Next to him, Remus was starting to scratch too. Sirius didn't think anything of it. more focused on James, who was asking, "Oh, really? Did we miss something then?" This was the drawback to doing everything together, Sirius realized. If he wanted to keep Remus's secret, he'd need to formulate some better excuses, or just stop doing all his homework with James. Suddenly, Remus leapt out of his seat. Sirius jerked around to look at him, his eyes wide with horror. His face had gone white. He was staring down at his own hands. "What's up, Lupin?" James asked, startled. Remus looked up at them, breathing hard, naked terror in his expression. Sirius realized that dark hair was sprouting from the back of Remus's hand, where he'd been scratching. Oh, bollocks. Sirius looked down at his collarbone. Sure enough, the same dark hair was sprouting. From his face, his hands, his arms, it grew in every bit of exposed skin. Oh, bloody hell. Across from him, James was experiencing the same conundrum. What's going on? Isn't it obvious? Sirius thought, glaring at the bag of sweets still sitting innocently on the table. "Peter," he growled, already knowing the answer to his question. "Are you sure your mum sent you those sweets?" The only one among them who hadn't eaten any of the candy, Peter spluttered, turning bright red, and squeaked out, "Well, I mean, I thought they were from her. They arrived this morning." "Peter!" James roared. People were turning in their seats now to stare at them, whispering and laughing. Pretty soon, the entire hall was craning their necks for a look at the 3 furry first years. Lol. The loudest laughter was coming from the Slytherin table, where Severus Snape looked close to hysterics. "Come on." Sirius stood up, squaring his shoulders and attempting to maintain some shred of dignity. "Let's go to the hospital wing. We can plot our revenge later." Although he could certainly see the humor in the prank, he hated the self-satisfied smirk that Severus shot him as they left. He hated that he'd let a Slytherin get the one-over on him. Down the table from Snape, Bellatrix and Narcissa were staring at Sirius disdainfully, which made him want to cringe. He had no doubt that his parents would be finding out about this, one way or another, though he doubted his cousins would be eager to share the news about the case of the itching boys in their own Hogwarts house. As they exited the hall, Sirius muttered darkly, "I told you they'd strike back." He thought of his cousins, smirking in their green robes, and gritted his teeth, determined to return the favour, not just to Snape, but to every Slytherin that he thought were better than him. Not just to Snape, but to every Slytherin that thought they were better than him. Although he attempted to laugh and joke with James, whose answer to most problems in life was a good sense of humour, the hot sting of shame curled in Sirius's belly, long after Madame Pomfrey had set them all back to normal. Chapter 11. First Year. Birthdays, Books, and the Beatles. Madame Pomfrey gave them a stern lecture on misusing magic before sending them on their way, which seemed to irk everyone except Remus. "As if we wanted to look like Bigfoot," James scoffed. Peter mumbled, "Yeah," in his typical fashion of echoing everything James said. Remus just stared straight ahead, looking unusually shaken by the whole situation. "It had to have been Severus. He coated the sweets with one of the potions. I know it." "Yeah, we all know it, mate." James shook his head. "Don't worry, we'll get him back." "I'm so sorry," Peter moaned. He hadn't stopped apologizing since they'd left the hall, and it made Sirius want to strangle him. "I really thought they were from my mum." "It's fine, Peter," James said benevolently. "I just wish you'd given them to us first thing on Monday. Then we could have at least bunked off Transfiguration." "I demand retribution," Sirius shouted, raising his wand dramatically. James laughed, and surprisingly, so did Remus. "And you shall have it!" James matched Sirius's melodramatic tone, grinning. "Patience is a virtue, Black, and vengeance takes time. Don't suppose you've got any other brilliant ideas, Remus?" "Sorry." Remus shook his head. He'd perked up a bit, but his skin was still quite pale, and he kept darting glances down at his hands, worried that the hair would be sprouting again. "I'll help you, James," Peter said eagerly. "I'll do anything. I won't be scared this time. They had just begun to turn the corner that led to the Gryffindor Tower when someone behind them called out, "Sirius?" All 4 boys turned, and Sirius's heart leapt in his throat. Bellatrix. She had always been his least favourite cousin, close enough in age that he had grown up with her tormenting him, but old enough to make him feel small. She stared down at him with her nose turned up, as if he were a particularly disgusting flobberworm that she was just about to step on. "What do you want?" Sirius asked, trying to sound nonchalant, even as he hunched instinctively, drawing his shoulders to his ears. James stepped forwards, standing at his side, and Sirius felt very grateful for his friend. "Oh, come here and address me properly," Bella snapped, voice icy. Sirius stayed, stubbornly, in place, until she withdrew her wand, which he knew from experience that she wouldn't hesitate to use. "Come here," her voice was low now, and dangerous, "or I'll make you. And it won't be a childish hair-growing charm, I promise." Sirius stumbled forward, shaking his head wordlessly at James when his friend tried to move with him. It was embarrassing enough that the other boys were watching this dressing down from his family, especially James. "That's better," Bellatrix tutted as he shuffled closer to her. Sirius fiddled with his wand, glaring at the ground. He wished his palms weren't so clammy. "I'd heard that you were running around with blood traitors and mudbloods now. I always thought you were a bit of an idiot, but even I'm surprised that you've become this much of a disgrace. You're still a black, let me remind you. You could stand to have a bit more dignity." Sirius flushed, glad that she wasn't speaking loudly enough for his friends to hear. Or at least he hoped she wasn't. "I mean, really, your actions do only reflect on you, Sirius. You're making the entire family look bad. Do you have any idea how I feel, knowing that my pea-brained cousin is mucking around with some like-sort muggle-loving—" "For Pete's sake, Bella, what do you want?" Sirius snapped, and he regretted it immediately when she levelled an icy stare at him, sending a chill down his spine. "Your parents are concerned about you," she sniffed. "They want to make sure that you aren't losing sight of your roots. Sissy and I have kindly offered to have tea with you on your birthday, in the Slytherin common room. Am I understood?" Sirius wanted to sink into the floor. Tea with his cousins was just about the worst way he could think to spend a birthday. Anger bit through him, mixing with the hot flush of shame as he listened to Bellatrix's voice every single fear he'd held since the sorting. Disgrace, disappointment, embarrassment. When he didn't respond, she spat his name. "Sirius!" He looked up, attempting a belligerent glare. It didn't seem to be very effective, though. He was still a mess of emotions. "I said, am I understood?" "Yes," he muttered, looking back at the floor. "Good." Bellatrix patted his head patronizingly, and Sirius fought the urge to jerk away from her touch. "Now, run along with your little blood traitor friends." She turned on her heel and left, robes sweeping behind her. Sirius walked back slowly, nerves on edge, chest still boiling with frustration, anxiety, and shame. None of them said a single word as they returned to their common room. It wasn't until they were seated on their usual sofa that James broke the silence. "All right, Sirius?" "Yeah," he nodded, making a belligerent effort at nonchalance. She just wanted to invite me for tea. On my birthday. I think my mother must have made her. Probably a family conference. Tried to bring me back into the fold." "Just because you're in a different house?" Sirius smirked. "And the company I'm keeping. So when's your birthday?" 2 weeks. The 3rd. I have to go to this tea, though. Bella's not joking about knowing some really vile curses. "We'll do something afterwards, then. Something good, yeah?" Peter and Remus both nodded enthusiastically, and Sirius felt a surge of gratitude for his friends. Wednesday, the 3rd of November, 1971. Happy birthday! Sirius woke up to James Potter, heir to one of the oldest pureblood families in Britain, flinging himself headlong into his friend's bed. He tackled Sirius, and the two started wrestling through the blankets, laughing. When Sirius finally managed to shove James off and step out of bed, he noticed Peter standing nervously across the room. Happy birthday, Sirius. Cheers, Pete. Sirius grinned, looking over towards Remus's bed. It was empty, curtains left open, bed still made. He, never got back last night, James said, when he saw Sirius looking. There was a moment of tense silence, and they all looked at the empty bed. Nothing, yet another disappearance from their friend. Where did he keep going? Finally, Sirius shrugged, saying with a forced cheer, "Probably off plotting the downfall of the Slytherins. Evil genius, that one." James and Peter chuckled, also a bit forced, and they all silently agreed not to talk about it. Classes were a drag, but James and Peter made it fun. They acted as if Sirius was royalty the entire day, holding doors open for him, carrying his books, even leaping out of their seats to bow to him when he managed to transfigure his goldfish before everyone else in class, which McGonagall did not find amusing. After lunch, James surprised Sirius with a flying lesson. Apparently he'd already gotten on Madame Hooch's good side. The three of them sped across the pitch, wind biting their faces and stealing laughter from their lips. Sirius was having such a good time that he was almost able to forget about his appointment with his cousins. Almost. But as the deadline loomed closer, he grew more and more nervous. James managed to cheer him up again at dinner, leading the whole Gryffindor table in a round of happy birthday, followed by, for he's a jolly good fellow. The rowdy Gryffindors continued to sing, and so say all of us, over and over, voices raising each time until Professor McGonagall finally threatened to give the whole house detention if they didn't stop. Tea with his cousins was just as bad as he expected it to be. He felt awkward and out of place in the Slytherin common room, surrounded by unfamiliar faces. He was even more acutely aware of the fact that these people would have been his friends, and this would have been his home, if things had gone as they should. It was jarring, seeing the future he never would have laid out before him. The entire time, Bellatrix kept up a steady stream of underhanded and overhanded insults, barbed jokes, and petty jabs about how much of a disappointment Sirius was becoming. Sissy didn't speak much, except to agree with her sister. Privately, Sirius wondered if they were just relieved that the attention had turned away from their immediate family onto his. Sirius had been fairly young when Andromeda ran off to marry a Muggle, but he remembered Narcissa and Bellatrix idolizing their big sister when they were little kids. He had never asked Andromeda about it directly, but he knew Bellatrix in particular felt betrayed. In the summer they received the wedding announcement. Bella had set her sister's room ablaze in a fury, burning everything Andromeda left behind. Neither Narcissa nor Bellatrix had spoken to their older sister since. In fact, Sirius was pretty sure that he was the only person in the family who was still in contact with Andromeda. She taught him how to use the Muggle post, since his parents didn't understand the concept of a post office. Sirius couldn't imagine anything ever coming between him and Reg like that. In fact, before he left to return to his own common room, he even made an attempt to ask about his brother. It was after yet another tangent from Bellatrix about how absolutely awful it was going to have to be to tell her dear aunt that the heir of the Black family was now befriending blood traitors. "She writes to you, then?" Bellatrix rolled her eyes. "Obviously. It's not as if you can be trusted to be honest about your situation." "And you too, Sissy?" "It's Narcissa. Do you reckon you could, maybe send a letter to Reg for me?" Narcissa's glare faltered as she was caught off guard. For a moment her brow furrowed, and she started to say, "Well, absolutely not," Bellatrix seethed. "As if he needs any of your influence right now. Honestly, Sirius, all you have to do is grow up and learn to behave with maturity, and I'm sure your parents will give you your owl back." She shook her head, chastising. Sirius flushed. "Right," he muttered. "Don't know why I even bothered asking." He left as soon as he could after that, seething all the way back to the Gryffindor common room. Neither of his cousins had wished him a happy birthday. He arrived back just before curfew, and when he stepped into their room, he felt ready for bed. He came face to face with Remus. They stared at each other a moment, and then, "Happy birthday, mate," Remus said weakly, looking a bit guilty. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his skin was sallow, like he'd been up all night. "Thanks," Sirius blinked, a bit surprised, and smiled back. Where were you? Got sick, Remus mumbled. Pomfrey made me stay in the hospital wing all day. It seemed a bit odd for an illness to come on so suddenly. Sirius wondered if there was something more that Remus wasn't telling them, especially as this wasn't his first disappearance. But none of the boys questioned the explanation, and the next morning there were classes to get to, and essays to write, and pranks to plan, and so many other things to think about. As winter approached, the boys spent less and less time outside, preferring to work huddled around a fire in the common room. When Sirius wasn't spending time with James, and Peter, who never seemed to leave his side, he was reading with Remus, and it took them just under 2 weeks to finish a history of magic, and Sirius then started alternating between A Beginner's Guide to Transfiguration and Magical Draughts and Potions. He even started reading aloud when he worked on homework to their group, although it led to scowling from James, who preferred silence. "It helps me think, Potter," Sirius would puff out his lip, pouting. "I've got to catch up to you somehow." This appealed to James's pride, as well as his instinct for helping those in need, as it was true that James had now pulled quite far ahead of Sirius in their classes, although Sirius let his friend believe it was because he'd been drastically and rapidly improving. That wasn't the case. James had been getting better, just not that much better. The truth was that Sirius had decided to no longer care about his schoolwork. It was all too easy anyway. He could get passable grades without even studying or taking notes, and do better than half the class if he bothered to glance over his books. And Bellatrix made it very clear during his birthday that something as frivolous as good marks would never be enough to win back his place on his parents' good graces. And Bellatrix had made it very clear during birthday lunch, that something as frivolous as good marks would never be enough to win back his parents' good graces. What did it matter if he came top of the class, if the class he was in was full of Gryffindors? So Sirius found other ways to occupy his time, namely researching. Ever since they had started reading together, Remus's marks had skyrocketed, and Sirius was sure that if he could just figure out the right spell, the boy would become a bonafide genius in no time. Sirius spent most of his spare time in the library, looking over cognitive interpretation spells that were supposed to be owl level, but didn't seem to be all too complicated once you grasped the basics. It was much more interesting than his classwork anyway. Remus had started to grow more comfortable around the boys as well, and around Sirius especially. He began to spend more time with them, and stopped sneaking off on his own so much. He even started to share his musical knowledge with Sirius, revealing that he'd actually seen the Beatles perform. Remus knew all about Muggles, and patiently weathered Sirius's many questions. By the end of the month, Sirius truly felt as though they had all become fast friends. Well, Peter still got on his nerves sometimes, a lot of the time, but that was expected. The Marauders would end most nights around the fire in the common room, plotting pranks and playing games of gobstones or exploding snap, laughing until their sides hurt before trudging upstairs to bed. Chapter 12. First Year, Christmas, 1971. Sirius hated Christmas. He always had, ever since he could remember. Christmas for the Blacks was meant for family dinners and boring galas, and far too many of Sirius's relatives hanging about in their dress robes. His mother was always on edge, ready to snap at a moment's notice under the stress of playing up the perfect hostess. His father grew sombre and strict, always watching his sons with a reproachful eye to ensure they did nothing to embarrass him. It was altogether joyless. Even the presents were boring. Books about family history or dusty heirlooms that served no purpose past decoration. So as November drew to a close and December edged brittle and biting into Hogwarts, Sirius grew more and more sullen. While other students chatted about holiday parties and presents and family visits, he scowled and threw himself into his research, spending hours in the library. Even James was becoming insufferable. He kept talking about his mother's mince pies, or how badly he hoped it would snow. "Last year, my dad apparated us to this huge hill outside of London. I side-alonged. It felt so weird. And he charmed the sledges so we wouldn't fall off. It was unbelievable how fast—" Sirius slammed his book shut. They were sitting in the common room, next to a roaring fireplace. Remus and Peter were playing a game of gobstones on the floor, and James was holding a Quidditch magazine. He hadn't been reading it, though. Instead, he seemed to be chattering on, once again, about Christmas. "Do you mind?" Sirius snapped. "I'm trying to read." James fell silent, and both Peter and Remus glanced up when they heard the book slam, a thick tome of ocular transfiguration. Now they watched him in tense silence. Sorry, mate," James said awkwardly. Remus's lips were pursed, like he thought Sirius was being ridiculous. And Peter was looking back down at his gobstones nervously. Sirius knew he wasn't being fair. He couldn't help responding to the sharp prick of irritation he felt at the excitement in James's voice. They would be boarding the train the following morning, and his own nerves were stretched thin. "It's fine," he muttered. "Too loud to concentrate down here anyway." He picked up the book and retreated to their room, hoping to make a dignified exit. He was already embarrassed about snapping at James. He got frustrated with Pete all the time, and even Remus, but never James. It felt strange. Of course, James Potter was too good to hold him against it. That night, when Sirius tiptoed over to his bed, the other boy let him in immediately. Sirius didn't even have time to speak before James was apologizing. "Look, Sirius, I'm sorry about earlier. I wasn't thinking. I know Christmas is rough for you." "No!" Sirius gasped, horrified with himself. "No! I should be the one apologizing. It's not your fault my family's awful. You have every right to be excited. I'll just try to be less of a miserable git." They were both smiling, all forgiven, and Sirius felt an incredible sense of relief. What would he do without James Potter? The next morning, Remus came to see them off at the station. He was staying at Hogwarts over the break. James had invited him to come visit, but apparently there was some sort of complication with the Muggle law that meant he wasn't allowed. James had also invited Sirius to stay with his family, but of course Sirius had to refuse. He could only imagine how his parents would respond if he asked to go to the Potters for Christmas. As they boarded the train, James promised Remus they'd write, saying conspiratorially, "See if you can come up with the next plan of attack on Snape." Remus nodded and smiled, waving them off at the platform. He looked a bit gloomy, but Sirius thought to himself that he'd switch places in a heartbeat. Mucking about at Hogwarts sounded much better than where he was going. Sirius tried to keep his promise to be less miserable on the train, but he was quiet and withdrawn for most of the ride. James didn't push him, keeping a steady conversation with Peter that carefully skirted around Christmas-related topics. As they drew closer and closer to London, Sirius found himself tuning them out, too preoccupied with his own thoughts to listen. By the time they reached the station, his heart was a closed fist in his chest. His father was there to pick him up. Orion frowned deeply as he watched his son bid goodbye to James Potter and Peter Pettigrew, but said nothing until they were out of the crowded station. "I thought I told you to stay away from the impure." Unlike his mother, whose voice grew shrill when she was upset, his father's voice only got quieter when he was angry. The words were hissed, venomous, and Sirius flinched. "James and Peter are purebloods too," he murmured defensively, staring down at his feet as they walked. His father sniffed. "The Potters are some of the worst blood traitors in history," he said fiercely. "And if they had their way, the entire wizarding world, our entire way of life, would crumble around us. Do you understand?" Sirius shrugged, and his father gripped his arms. "Answer me when I speak to you, boy." Sirius's arm ached where the fingers dug into his flesh, and he grit his teeth. "I understand." His arrival home was just as horrible as Sirius expected it to be. It had only been a few months since he left, but it was still jarring to approach the dark manor with his family crest emblazoned over the front door. It didn't look any different, but as he entered the wood-panelled halls and passed under the sneering portraits of his ancestors, Sirius couldn't deny that he felt different. Less like home. He missed the cozy warmth of the Gryffindor common room. His mother was waiting in the sitting room, along with... "Reg," Sirius breathed, smiling for the first time since he'd stepped onto the Hogwarts Express. He started forward, grinning, eager to greet his brother, but Regulus shrank back slightly, and didn't return his smile. Sirius halted, stung. What was that about? He realized quickly that it must be the presence of his parents that had caused Regulus to withdraw. His mother abhorred to what she referred to as mawkish displays of sentiment. She had intoned countless times that such affection was unmasculine and a sign of weakness. Still, Sirius had hoped, his brother would be excited to see him. His mother set in immediately, droning on about how incredibly disappointed she was in the sorting, how he had brought shame to the entire family, how his great-aunt had nearly had a fit when she heard the news. This verbal lashing led into what seemed to be an endless series of rules for his behavior now that he was at home. He was to act at all times with decorum and respect in the Black family name. Throughout his cheerful greeting, Regulus remained silent, barely meeting Sirius's eye. His mother's words hardly even stung, because Sirius was too busy trying to figure out what, exactly, was going on with his brother. Was Reg mad at him for failing to write? It wasn't as if he'd have control of the situation. He'd done his best. There was no chance to talk about it, though, until later that night. Once everyone was in bed, Sirius had snuck out of his room, darting down the hall. Regulus sat up when he opened the door. It was dark, but the moon was waxing outside, nearly full, and the light spilling through the windows was enough to see. Sirius? Reg! Sirius shut the door behind him, bounding eagerly into the bed. He grinned down at his brother. Did you miss me? Reg shifted uncomfortably, darting glances down at the floor. He still wasn't smiling. Come on, you'll get us in trouble. Oh, please. Sirius rolled his eyes. You know they'll only punish me. It's not as if you've snuck out of bed. And I wanted to see you. I missed you. Finally, a small smile curved across his brother's face. Really? Of course. Sirius tried to ignore the guilt crawling around inside his chest as he thought of how much he had dreaded coming home, even if it meant seeing his brother again. I tried to write. Did you get my letters? Yeah, sort of. Mum wouldn't let me read them. They made her really angry. Reg drew his knees up to his chest, wrapping his arms around himself. Ugh, I knew she was behind it. The old bat. Sirius scowled, and Reg giggled nervously. Don't worry. I'll tell you all about it. And he did, whispering about classes and the magic and the friends he'd made. He talked about how it felt to soar around on the Quidditch pitch, the acrid smell of the potion exploding in class, the way the ghost looked silvery in the candlelight of the great hall. There's this great big fireplace in the Gryffindor common room. You'll see it next year. James and I are going to try and figure out if we can pinch some of the potion ingredients to change the colours. What? The colours of the flames. If you add powdered newt. No, I meant... Regulus frowned, brow furrowed. What do you mean? I'll see you next year. Sirius blinked. Or when you're at Hogwarts? Yeah, I know, but Sirius... The door to Regulus's room swung open, and Creature burst in. Aha! He cried in his awful Rudy voice. The young master is out of bed. Oh, bollocks. After the first week, his mother placed a locking charm on his door to ensure that Sirius remained in his own room at night. In retaliation, Sirius swapped around all of the plaques under the portraits in the hallway, so that each of the paintings had the incorrect name. This only made his mother angrier. She rapped a ruler against the back of his knuckles until they were bruised, then made him switch everything back with his aching fingers. Just let it go, Regulus said that evening, as Sirius skulked into the library. You'll only make her more upset. A marauder never backs down, Sirius insisted, frowning. He was trying to remember the prank that Remus had explained to him, something that involved laundry. Regulus rolled his eyes and said a bit sharply, You're not at Hogwarts, Sirius. I'm a marauder. A marauder never abandons his code. Reg shook his head, but he was smiling a little as he said, exasperated. Honestly, you're as bad as your mudblood friends. Sirius froze. What? Regulus blinked, smile dropping. Your friends. I mean, it's just... Mum says they're a bad influence. Yeah, well, Mum's a right bitch, isn't she? Sirius snapped. Anger coiled in his veins. Since when was his little brother throwing around words like mudblood? Reg looked hurt. You shouldn't say things like that. And you shouldn't talk about my friends. Sirius stood, seething. I'm sorry, Reg said, placating. Come on, Sirius, don't go, I'm sorry. Sirius huffed, still hot with anger, but he sat back down, muttering, James and Peter are purebloods anyway. Yeah, you told me, Reg said. It was discomforting. Sirius had never felt so out of sync. He and Reg had always been on the same page, his little brother listening eagerly to every word. Sirius thought that Reg understood, as he did, that most of what their parents said was horseshit. But 4 months had made a difference. During his weeks at home, Sirius felt out of step more and more often, and kept making comments expecting Reg to agree, only for his little brother to shake his head or roll his eyes. And the more Sirius spoke about Hogwarts, the more Regulus seemed to withdraw, as if hearing about the school made him angry. Sirius couldn't figure out what he was doing wrong. There were moments where he thought they might even fight, but at the end of the day, Reg always softened, shrugging off whatever was bothering him, to smile and laugh along with his brother. In those moments, it felt as though nothing changed. Things were easy, effortless between them. They were still best friends, after all. Friday, the 23rd of December, 1971. On the day of the annual Black Family Christmas party, Sirius and his brother were firmly on the same page. They spent the morning complaining to each other about the new dress robes their mother was making them wear, and they made a game of running around the house, hiding from Creature. By the time the haggard house elf finally found them and sent them to wash up, the boys were giggling, faces flushed. And then their relatives started to arrive. The Blacks had a family dinner every year on the day before Christmas Eve, and this year was no different. Aunts, uncles, cousins, second cousins. As the manor began to fill with people, Reg became more and more withdrawn, while Sirius slouched, messing up his hair and muttering his hellos. Regulus was the perfect picture of decorum, not a hair out of place, robes neatly pressed. He greeted each family member with perfect poise, exactly the way his parents expected. After their great aunt swept by, Sirius nudged Reggie, grinning. Oi, my lord, should I bow to you? Regulus rolled his eyes, but his lips quirked up. Come on, it's not that hard to behave for one night. Maybe not for you, Sirius lamented dramatically, but for a marauder. Oh, quit it with the marauders, Regulus snapped. Sirius fell silent, a bit surprised by the sting in his brother's voice. Look, let's just not make her mad tonight, all right? Please. Sirius didn't need to ask who he was talking about. As their next relative approached, he leaned in to whisper petulantly, You used to be fun. Reg stiffened, mouth a thin line, but he didn't respond. Sirius was in a sour mood for the rest of the night, and he slumped into his chair at dinner. He picked at the first course, ignoring the chatter of his relatives around them. It was all the same boring stuff as usual. Who got a new promotion at the ministry, whose child had run off and married a muggle, whose niece was rumoured to be a squib, and then Sirius heard something that caught his attention. A disgrace, but nowhere near as bad as the Potters, his aunt said primly, waving her glass of wine. Her husband chimed in. Oh, don't get me started on Fleamont. The new reforms he's trying to push at the Muggle Relations Department are ridiculous. I'm ashamed to even work in the same building as him. Across the table, Bellatrix was watching Sirius with a mean glint in her eye. When she saw him looking back at her, she smiled. Sirius, isn't the Potter boy one of your little friends? Her parents fell silent, turning to look at him. Down the table, his own parents were staring too, obviously appalled. Yeah, Sirius said, flushing. He felt like everyone had gone quiet, listening for his answer. I told you to stop hanging around with that boy, Sirius, his father admonished loudly. You're to stop spending time with him immediately, at the start of next term. Am I clear? Anger crawled once more up Sirius's throat. He spoke without thinking. And how am I supposed to do that? He's my roommate, in case you forgot. His father's face went bright with rage, and his mother hissed, "Sirius, do not speak to your father like that." "Oh, don't worry, Sirius," crooned Bellatrix, grinning wickedly. "I'm sure no one will be forgetting who your housemates are any time soon." Around the table, his entire family was staring at him, their expressions ranging from mild disappointment to utter disgust. Sirius flushed with shame. He looked over at Regulus, but his brother was staring down at his plate, silent. "Fine, then." He lifted his chin, directing his next words towards Bellatrix. "Great! I'm proud to be in Gryffindor, so I don't have to hang around with a bunch of slimy gits like you and your friends." "Sirius!" his mother screeched. "Proud?" Orion bellowed, slamming down his goblet. "Proud? You've brought the entire family shame." Across the table, his uncle nodded. "I never thought I'd see the day the Black Heir would become a blood traitor. I was so embarrassed to hear the news. 500 years, and—" Across the hall, his relatives broke out into protest, everyone shouting over each other. Sirius's heart was thudding in his chest, and he felt tears pricking at the corners of his eyes. It was so loud. "Enough!" Walpurga almost screamed. Finally, everyone fell silent. She turned her cold gaze to Sirius. "Go to your room. Now." Sirius held her eyes for a moment, but then relented, slamming his fork down and pushing his chair roughly away from the table. He held his head high as he left, hoping that his family couldn't see his shoulders shaking. That night, Sirius didn't turn when the door to his room opened. He could hear Reg creeping in, painfully slowly. "Sirius?" Silence. Fury beat like a heartbeat against his rib cage, and he felt hot and prickly all over. "I know you're awake." Regulus crept closer to his bed, and the mattress shifted as his brother climbed in. Sirius grimaced into his pillow. "Go away, Reg." "Sirius, just go away. I thought you were worried about getting in trouble." Now he was sitting up, having thrown the blankets off so that he could face his brother. Regulus watched him, eyes wide and repentant. "Sirius, I'm sorry," he said. "I really am. I told you not to make them mad." Sirius barked a laugh. "Really? Come to say I told you so." "No, that's not—" "Oh, shove off, Reg." Now there was a spark of frustration in his brother's eyes. "You're not being fair. Come on, it's not like we could have stopped them." Sirius knew Reg was right, but it still hurt. He didn't know how to say that it had always been the two of them against their family, against the world, that Regulus's silence was a betrayal, an abandonment, a broken promise. "You could have done something, instead of leaving me alone." But now it was Reg's turn to laugh. Incredulously, he said, "Leaving you alone?" The words hung between them, guilt and anger twisted together in Sirius's chest. "I told you to go away." He reached out, shoving Regulus hard. His brother fell back into the mattress, flailing to keep his balance and stop himself from falling over the edge, pajamas twisting around his legs, and oh. They froze. They were both breathing hard, chests heaving, even though they'd been whispering. Sirius stared down at his brother's leg, where his trousers had twisted up, revealing the bottom half of his calf. There were 3 straight, thin lines down the middle of the skin. Sirius looked up, and their eyes met. "Reg," his brother flushed, reaching down hurriedly to adjust his pajamas, scurrying away from the top of the blankets. "Reggie, did she—" "I don't want to talk about it." Sirius swore. "That bitch." "Don't call her that," Regulus said sharply, and Sirius looked at him in disbelief. "Reg, she hurt you." "She wouldn't hurt me." His voice rose defensively. "She's my mother." For a moment, Sirius stunned into silence. Then quietly, "She's my mother too." When Regulus refused to meet his eyes, Sirius continued. "Come on, you know it's not right. She's only trying to do what's best for me," Regulus whispered furiously, words tipping right over each other. "To make sure I don't end up like—" He stopped abruptly. Sirius felt sick. "Go ahead," he said flatly. Reg shook his head, looking away. "No." "Go ahead," Sirius urged, anger licking the back of his voice. "Say it, Reg. I want to hear it." "Sirius. To make sure you didn't end up like me, right? Is that it?" His brother's eyes were shiny with tears, but Sirius didn't care. He pushed himself out of bed, grabbing a travelling coat from his wardrobe. "Sirius!" Regulus whispered. When his brother ignored him, he tried again. "Sirius, where are you going?" Sirius shut the door of the wardrobe roughly and grabbed his wand from where he stored it in his desk. "Home," he said. It was raining in Hogsmeade, cold water pelting Sirius as he struggled up towards the school grounds. Wind whipping raindrops past the heavy hood of his cloak until his hair was dripping wet. He waited until the early morning, while it was still dark, to sneak out of his room. His parents kept flue powder in an office down the hall, and there was no telling where Creature might be roaming at night. Near dawn, though, the house elves started on breakfast, and Sirius knew he would be sequestered in the kitchen. He'd held his breath as he tiptoed down the hall, sure that he'd opened the office door to find his father waiting, but Regulus hadn't alerted anyone, and he hadn't gone to wake their parents or find Creature. He hadn't tried to stop Sirius from leaving at all. No one approached him as he tromped through the muddy grass and made his way to Hogwarts' front entrance. The doors opened easily, and the halls were empty. The only sound of the snoring portraits, and Sirius's own cloak dripping water on the floor. He had to wake up the fat lady to give her the password, and she grumbled as she swung open the door, allowing him entrance into the common room. Remus sat up when the door to their room swung open, rubbing his eyes. For a moment he just blinked in the dark, but then his face split into a grin. "Sirius!" He leapt out of bed, clearly overjoyed to see his friend. Sirius couldn't help but grin, pushing the wet hair out of his face. "All right, Lupin." He tried to keep his voice nonchalant as he dropped his cloak onto the floor, even though his body still felt wired with adrenaline. He and Reg had always talked about running away from home, but neither of them had actually done it. "Freezing, isn't it?" Sirius pointed his wand at the fireplace. "Incendio! What are you doing here?" "Had enough." He looked down at his boots, which were caked in mud, and concentrated on pulling them off. Got into an argument with Dad, and the whole family got into it. All the usual stuff. Called me a blood traitor, shame of the family, etc., etc. He collapsed back onto his bed, heart racing at the memory of his family's voices. So I left. James would have wanted to talk about it, to ask if he was okay, to tell him he shouldn't be ashamed, to insist that his parents were wrong. Sirius braced himself, but Remus just said, "Wow, how'd you get here?" Good old Remus. "Flue powder?" Sirius shrugged. "To the pub in the village, then I just walked." "Wow," Remus repeated. Before the other boy could ask any more questions, Sirius sat up. "I'm starving. They sent me to bed last night without any dinner. Come on, get dressed. Breakfast." Although they attempted to take their seats as usual in the Great Hall, acting as though nothing were wrong, McGonagall stormed over immediately. "Mr. Black," she said sharply, "what is the meaning of this?" Sirius smiled cheekily. "Missed you too, Professor." Her lips twitched, but the frown remained staunchly on her face. "You were seen walking into the grounds of Hogsmeade at 6 o'clock this morning. Do you care to explain yourself any further?" Sirius shook his head. "Not really, Professor. That's pretty much all there is to it." McGonagall shook her head and sighed, a note of pity in her eyes. It made Sirius uncomfortable. "Very well, Mr. Black. I shall have to contact your parents, of course, so they know where you are." But a flock of owls was swooping into the room, and Sirius could see the largest of them, a stately eagle owl, clutching a thick red envelope. "No need," he said. The bird dropped the letter onto his plate. He looked down at it pointedly, and then smiled wryly up at McGonagall. "I think they know exactly where I am." He held her eye as he picked it up, ripping it open before anyone could see his fingers trembling. Immediately his mother's voice filled the hall, shrill and icy with rage. The other students turned to look, and McGonagall winced. "Sirius Orion Black!" his mother's voice screamed. "How dare you defy your father in this manner?" Next to him, Remus covered his ears, but Sirius remained completely still, refusing to drop McGonagall's gaze. "Consorting with half-breeds and blood traitors, turning your back on our family. If your grandfather were alive, he would have disowned you the moment you were sorted." You will remain at school until the end of the year and think about the shame and dishonor you have brought to our noble title. Don't think we won't disinherit you. You are not our only son." With that, the letter burst into flames until there was nothing but a pile of ash on the table. The silence that followed was suffocating. Sirius could feel the eyes of every person in the room on him. Let them watch, then, he thought, anger still a blistering ember in his belly, but he kept his composure, spooning scrambled eggs nonchalantly onto his plate and glancing up at McGonagall again. "I can send my mother an owl if you like, Professor, but I doubt she'll read it." "Very well, Sirius," McGonagall nodded. "Just try to keep out of trouble, will you?" She made her way stiffly back to the teacher's table at the far end of the hall. Sirius ate his breakfast in silence, skin prickling with the gazes of the other students. Even Remus was staring at him, wide-eyed, as if he couldn't believe what he'd just witnessed. Sirius tried to ignore the embarrassment that bled like oil through his body, choking down his food. "I don't care," he reminded himself fiercely. "Who gives a toss what they think?" But he still felt a wash of relief when he'd finished eating, and was able to leave the curious stares behind. The next morning was much better. They woke on Christmas Day. Sirius and Remus discovered piles of wrapped presents on their beds. Remus looked perplexed at the unwrapped, lumpy package containing various snacks, along with a set of gobstones from James and a box of chocolates from Peter. "Merry Christmas," Sirius said, stifling a yawn. Peter had sent him a box of frogs too, and there was an annual of his favourite Quidditch team from James, which made him smile. Merry Christmas, Remus responded. "I didn't get anyone any presents." He scratched at his ear, looking a bit guilty. "I didn't know they would." "Oh, don't worry about it," Sirius reassured him, heading towards the bathroom. "No one expected you to." When he came back into the room, there was a large, flat, square package on his bed. Andromeda. Sirius ripped it open as fast as he could, buzzing with excitement. "It's from Andromeda," he explained to Remus, who had responded to his enthusiasm with a bemused grin. When he pulled the record out of the package, Remus's eyes lit up, and he hurried over. Every holiday, Andromeda sent him a Muggle album. It was how Sirius had amassed his collection, his most prized possessions, aside from his wand. This one had a black cover, overlaid with an image of a man standing in front of a huge amplifier, playing the guitar. His hair was wild and curly, and he had a powerful stance, legs apart, outlined in gold. "Electric Warrior," read the text. "T-Rex." "Oh, T-Rex. I think I've heard of them," Remus murmured. Sirius flipped the album over, eagerly scanning the track listening. Remus shifted impatiently. "Oh, stick it on," he urged, eyes bright with excitement. Sirius did, sliding out the disc carefully and placing it gently onto his turntable. They watched as it began to spin, and the room filled with music, a smooth, sliding throb. They sat hypnotized and utterly immersed in the music. When it stopped, Sirius flipped the record immediately onto the B-side, and they sat in silence while it played. When it was over, Sirius wordlessly turned the record and began again at the beginning. Remus was the best person to listen to music with. Unlike James and Peter, he didn't talk, he didn't get distracted. For the slower, dreamier songs, they lay next to each other on the bed, sharing smiles. On the catchier riffs, they tapped their feet or swayed with the melodies. They didn't need to speak. As long as the music was playing, the entire world fell away, and Sirius felt warm and safe. Eventually, halfway through the second listen, Frank came in. "Merry Christmas, lads. Come on, breakfast." The great hall was an explosion of colour. Glittering ropes of red, green, and gold tinsel sparkled from every rafter, and 12 enormous trees twinkled with multicoloured lights and baubles on every branch. Sirius grinned, thinking to himself that maybe Christmas wouldn't be so bad after all. After breakfast, the boys raced back to their room, where Sirius immediately started playing the album again. When they had listened through it a third time, Remus announced, "This is the coolest thing I've ever heard." Sirius nodded solemnly, elated that the other boy loved it as much as he did. They spent the rest of their day eating their way through Peter's chocolate frogs, playing rowdy games of exploding snap and listening to music in the common room. By dinner time, Sirius had memorized all of the words to Jeepster. He hummed it between his bites of food, watching Remus stuff his face, and by the time the meal was over, they were both tapping their feet. As Sirius went to bed that night, he didn't think about his family, or his mother's letter, or even his brother. Instead, he played T-Rex on repeat in his mind, falling asleep with the melodies in his head.